Hello and welcome to RSM's Cyber Insights for Pension Schemes. With the increasing level and sophistication behind cyber attacks, the pensions industry must be alert to the threats to pension scheme member data and pension scheme assets that arise from the risk of a successful cyber attack. Through this series of practical tips videos, Stuart and I are aiming to make trustees' responsibilities in this area clearer. Hi Stuart. Could you perhaps summarise what the expectations are for trustees and scheme managers?
Yes, I think looking at the general code, there is an increasing and really a significant expectation on how trustees and scheme managers are ultimately going to discharge their obligations, and that really is key around understanding risk and exposure across the entirety of their footprint. But also actually ensuring that appropriate level of controls are in place to try and manage that risk.
Mm-hmm.
We've also seen through some recent cyber attacks that actually there's an underlying spirit from that regulation coming through. And that's been really well demonstrated through the expectation of trustees with warning scheme members of potential pension scams, but also the ability and provision in place to monitor for unusual traffic when it comes to looking through pension administration systems.
So I think then in terms of expectations, what we're seeing is a real sense that as an industry, there should be a drive for a minimum standard, which will then hopefully improve things for everyone.
Yeah, I think we've certainly seen that being called from, or the TPR ultimately coming under pressure from that aspect. But I think also it's incumbent on trustees to really start driving the expectation with the third parties. Mm-hmm. And I think that is then ultimately going to provide a much higher level of value across the whole sector, which ultimately is going to be good for the protection of members as well as scheme assets.
Over recent years, there's certainly been a lot said about the expectations on trustees to ensure that appropriate controls are in place to protect members' data and assets. However, when we're speaking to pension scheme trustee boards and scheme managers about how actually to discharge these expectations, it's still far from clear. So we've put together a series of tips for trustees to help them with that. Stuart, our first tip for pension scheme trustees is that they need to build appropriate cyber awareness. But what does that actually mean?
Yeah, I think it's important to also acknowledge that actually 3/4 of trustees are undertaking cyber training. But also with that, we do know that breaches are continuing to increase across the sector. So good awareness really is driven from the point of tailoring. Really tailoring to the needs of the trustees, the scheme managers, and ultimately the schemes that's really going to reflect the operational context in which they're operating. And of course, that really includes the broadness of their ecosystem.
So from a practical perspective, what should trustees be doing?
Well, as I said, that tailoring is absolutely key. Making sure that the training that's being delivered really talks to the needs of the trustees, but ultimately with a focus on the trustees being able to gain that knowledge, ultimately to embed cyber resilience across their ecosystem. And that has to start with an understanding of the level of risk and exposure that they're through, but also the threats that are coming through from their suppliers. Once that's understood, it's really about understanding what good looks like in terms of controls and really putting plans in place to go out and achieve that particular standard or framework that they're looking to work to.
Great, thank you. So that's the first tip. Trustees need to build cyber awareness. When they do so, that will enable trustees to build their knowledge and apply appropriate levels of challenge in order to get to grips with the risk and exposure of scheme assets and data. Previously, in our first tip, we covered the need for trustees and scheme managers to build appropriate cyber awareness. The second tip builds on that and covers the need to understand your cyber footprint in order to understand and manage risk. So, Stuart, perhaps you could explain what we mean by a cyber footprint.
Of course. So ultimately, the cyber footprint is really a combination of data. It's everywhere that your data is, everywhere that your data has been, and also the consideration of where your data will be in the future. And of course, in the sector, we know that there's an enormous amount of dependency on outsourced activity. And this really goes to where data is being processed and stored, but also where it's transmitted and potentially later transferred as part of ongoing services. And it's really important that trustees understand the value of data from both a business lens, but also from the potential of a threat. And of course, the threat to third parties absolutely need to be considered as part of the scheme's threat and risk exposure. So ultimately, when building all of this into a risk register, trustees are going to be able to really demonstrate their understanding of risk informed by criticality of providers based on their assets that they hold, the data in terms of where it's stored, and ultimately that oversight of exposure and threats.
So from what you've just said, it feels like the cyber footprint can actually be very wide. It's more than the member data held with the administrator, for example. Trustees need to be thinking much wider than that.
Absolutely. And, a lot of the trustees that we work with do jump straight to the administrator as the main point of the footprint. I think when you look at other outsourced activity, certainly when thinking of rectification projects, investments, actuary services, and so on, it's really important to understand those providers and the value of the data they hold, because again, ultimately that really does form the extent of the footprint for a scheme.
Thanks, Stuart. So that's the second tip. Trustees need to understand their cyber footprint, because let's face it, if you don't know where your data is, you can't be in a position to protect it. We've explained previously that, first of all, trustees need to build appropriate cyber awareness, and second of all, they need to understand their cyber footprint. We've also explained that a pension scheme's cyber footprint can actually be very extensive. So once cyber risks are captured in a risk register, the next insights tip is to challenge and gain assurance from your third parties that form part of that cyber footprint. Stuart, could you give us some advice as to what this might actually look like?
Yes, of course. Well, obviously armed with that risk register, I think, the trustees are going to be in a great starting point in respect of understanding the criticality and order in which they should be seeking assurance from their third parties. And of course, this should be driven through a trust but verify approach, where obviously there is an appropriate level of challenge that trustees are putting forward to suppliers, ultimately to gain the right level of confidence in their control position. And whilst certifications and accreditations are clearly important, I think really understanding the scope of coverage in respect of the services that are being provided to trustees, and where, if there are gaps, that ultimately additional assurance is gained against relevant controls that may have been applied.
So it sounds like this isn't a do it once and then it's done exercise. It's constant monitoring. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, the cyber risk landscape changes at quite a pace. So it is really important that the view on risk is quite dynamic. And one of the best ways of doing that is to work really closely with third parties, ultimately to get a consistency in reporting and define some metrics that are ultimately going to provide a knowledge around the potential of different trends, as well as to be able to identify emerging issues that ultimately could lead to that increased exposure for the scheme.
Great, thank you. So that's our third tip. Trustees need to challenge and gain assurance from their third parties. And while some of those third parties might have existing accreditations, trustees really must ensure that these are fit for their specific purposes. Once trustees have raised their awareness of cyber threats, they've documented and mapped their cyber footprint, and they've challenged and sought to gain assurance from third-party providers, the final tip is that trustees need to set clear expectations and be prepared to respond to a cyber attack. Stuart, in which particular areas do trustee boards need to be setting expectations?
Well, for me, it has to start with policy. I think, looking at the level of clarity that can be provided in key policies, but ultimately really driving the relevance and the practicality behind them, especially when we're considering policies through risk management, incident response, of course, control requirements and roles and responsibilities. And I do just want to emphasize on the relevant and practical point. If policies are not appropriate to the operational context, then ultimately they're not really enforceable or consistent. And that certainly needs to go across all parties that hold or access scheme assets or data. And also, when thinking about that outsourced activity, really understanding the third party elements and the interlink between policies and processes, as well as incident response plans, are really key.
So thinking about that and building on that, what do trustees need to do in order to be prepared to respond to a cyber attack?
Well, I think when considering a cyber attack, I think in most instances, multiple parties, especially in the ecosystem, are going to be impacted. So really having prepared incident response plans that consider priority actions, decision points, information flow, but also notification requirements. And all of that being really well practiced and again communicated across all of the key parties that are likely to be involved in any particular attack. And that, with those cyber attack exercises, is really vital for schemes to be able to swiftly resume operations, but also importantly to maintain trust and reputation across its members, the regulators, and of course third parties.
So it sounds like it's not enough for trustees to check that their providers have got an incident response plan in place. It's, they need to have their own sort of overarching response plan. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. I think when looking at incident response plans, there are key decision points and direction that trustees need to provide as part of that overall response. And it also needs to consider that the trustees may not know initially who the affected party of any particular breach is. So really important that they have that ability to drive direction, but also ultimately be able to engage with the right parties to try and understand more about a potential breach.
Great, thank you. So that's our final tip. Trustees should set clear expectations and also have plans in place in order to be prepared to respond to a cyber attack. We hope you found this series of tips insightful, and if you'd like to hear more from RSM, then do follow the link to select your preferences and keep up to date with our events and insights on a wide variety of topics. Thanks very much for listening.